Let me introduce our next speaker, Catherine Tsai, who's a PhD student at Harvard in the program in History and East Asian Languages, doing something a bit different from the first two papers, so we're squarely in the layers created by Japanese colonialism, I guess. Let me leave it like that and just turn this over to Catherine. Thank you.
So thank you, Rob and Diania, for organizing this workshop, and to Maria for the logistical support. So my name is Catherine Tsai. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard for about 2 more months. And then I graduate, which is kind of scary. But broadly speaking, I study the history of overseas Taiwanese in Okinawa and Japan. So when thinking about layers, one way sort of to approach this question is like, how do we approach Taiwanese history from outside of Taiwan? So today's talk is going to focus on the naturalization movement in the Yaeyama Islands from the 1960s up until 1972. To give you a sense of the space, right, we can see that the Yaeyama Islands are very, very close to Taiwan. They consist of, right, Ishigaki here. This is actually not Takitomi, that's Yurikote, and then Yonaguni. And then earlier, right, where Professor Simon talked about the Miyako Islands. And so today's talk will focus on what the naturalization movement meant for the overseas Taiwanese who are living in Okinawa in the post-war era. And to sort of build off of the theme that Professor Simon talked about previously, how it facilitated a form of reconciliation between the Taiwanese and the Okinawans who are living there. So here's another map just to sort of emphasize how close these islands are. Right? Japan is up here, Okinawa is down here, Taiwan's down here, and the Yaeyama Islands are right here. And because of this close geographic proximity under the Japanese Empire, there was a lot of movements of goods and labor right, between these two places. This was especially true in the 1930s when there was about 2,000 Taiwanese who were living in Ishigaki alone. Now, the story of the overseas Taiwanese community is a fairly well-known story in Taiwan and in Okinawa. A lot of these histories have approached it from the perspective of immigration. So the first author to do this was Matsuda Yoshitaka, who is a journalist for the Yaeyama Mainichi Shimbun, the local newspaper there. And he's the one that really documented the experiences of the first and second generation Taiwanese who are living in these islands. And then in 2016, Taiwanese director sort of filmed a documentary that focuses on the lives of one particular family, the Tamaki family, and explores what it means to be Taiwanese for the second and third generation. And then more recently, the Okinawa Times, which is the main regional newspaper in Okinawa, published a travelogue that explains how this immigrant community shaped the economy and the culture of the island, right, pointing out their contributions to the pineapple industry, as well as sort of the ways they influence sort of the cultural life of the island, with this image of Tudigong. Right, so if you ever have the chance to visit Ishigaki, it'll become very apparent very quickly that this place looks very, very different from the rest of Okinawa. And one of the main reasons why that is because of this immigrant community. Now, in Anglophone scholarship, this immigrant story hasn't really been explored as much. Most of the scholarship that exists really focuses on the perspective of imperialism and colonialism. We have a book by Hiroko Matsuda who talks about Okinawan migration to Taiwan, noting how this migration shows that the Yaeyama Islands really served as a satellite of Taiwan. Right? So a lot of the economy of this particular region was tied to Taiwan during the colonial period because Taiwan was much bigger, more urban, more cosmopolitan, and much more developed. In another book that talks a little bit about the overseas Taiwanese and the Yaeyama Islands is Eiichiro Azuma, who mentions very briefly in one of his chapters the transplantation of a smooth cayenne Hawaiian pineapple. from Hawaii to Taiwan, and then from Taiwan to Ishigaki, examining this theme of frontier development and settler colonialism. And another work that talks about this space is Alexander Zoltan's article on a 1973 documentary called Asia is One. This documentary is actually being shown at the Harvard Film Archive on April 28th. So if you are in this area, I highly recommend watching it. It was considered a lost documentary for a long time. It was rediscovered in 2016, and it's one of those rare documentaries that shows what life was like in post-war Okinawa that focuses on non-Okinawans. So a lot of Taiwanese make appearances in that movie. So my contribution sort of to this field is to think about what the naturalization movement can tell us, right, about the collapse of the Japanese Empire, and also how that forms public memories of what the Taiwanese were doing in the Yaeyama Islands under Japanese colonialism. So my talk is going to attempt to answer three main questions. What was the legal status of the Taiwanese in Okinawa after 1945? Why did naturalization become a geopolitical problem? Right? And how did this process of naturalization impact local memories of this overseas Taiwanese community? So let's go back to the Japanese Empire. Beginning in the 1930s, the Okinawan prefectural government instituted a plan for economic revitalization that hinged upon land reclamation. And one of the main actors that participated in land reclamation in Okinawa were the Taiwanese. So this is a newspaper in Taiwan called the Taiwanichi Nichi Shinpo. This is actually the Chinese language version of the newspaper. And what's notable about the Chinese language version of this newspaper is that it directly targets Taiwanese farmers to go to Okinawa to engage in land reclamation. Right? The Japanese language version of this article basically says there's an opportunity to go engage in land reclamation, but they are sort of more interested in targeting the Japanese settlers who were in Taiwan, not the Taiwanese farmers. But the Chinese language article has a different target audience. So this is the sort of push point for a lot of Taiwanese to start immigrating to the Yaeyama Islands in the 1930s. And their presence in the Yaeyama Islands at this time was very contentious. A lot of the local islanders view them as a kind of settler colonist because they are engaging in land reclamation. So there's a very tense relationship that happens. But then after the collapse of the Japanese Empire in 1945, the majority of these Taiwanese returned back to Taiwan. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, there were about 2,000 Taiwanese who were in Ishigaki during this time. After 1945, there's a little under 200 who remained. And for those who remained, they decide to stay there because of the political turmoil that is happening in Taiwan at the time as the KMT is coming over. Now, these Taiwanese are allowed to stay in Okinawa without any problems, right, despite becoming foreigners. But then there are legal changes that happen in Okinawan society in the 1950s that start to make their life a little more difficult. So for context, between 1945 and 1950, Okinawa was under US military rule, and then from 1950 to 1972, Okinawa transitions to civilian rule. And in that process of transitioning to civilian rule, the Okinawan government, under the influence of the United States, starts to make distinctions between who is Okinawan and who is not. Right? So before, it didn't really matter, but now, right, there's an effort to try to make sort of legal distinctions between the populations, and that has an impact on their legal rights. So in 1953, the United States Civil Administration of the Ryukyu Islands passes Ordinance number 93, which defines a Ryukyuan as someone who had resided in Okinawa before September of 1945, right, or someone who has obtained permanent resident status based on the permission of the High Commissioner of the Ryukyu Islands. And anyone who doesn't sort of qualify for those two are just considered non-Ryukyuans, or they're foreigners. Now, the problem with this definition is that the Taiwanese technically fit in with the Ryukyuan definition because they had immigrated to Ishigaki in the 1930s, and they stayed there. And this creates a problem. So the broader geopolitical context is that Japan has claimed residual sovereignty over Okinawa, and part of that claim is, right, the Okinawans and the Japanese are the same people. So if you allow foreigners into that population, it starts to dilute that Japanese claim. Right? So in response to this problem, USCAR passes Ordinance 125 the following year, which limits the definition of Ryukyuans to people who have a honseki, or like a family register in Okinawa. And the Taiwanese, because they have family registers in Taiwan, are automatically excluded. So then after 1954, they are defined as foreigners. So this creates a problem for a lot of the Okinawa, or for the Taiwanese who are living there. First, it restricts your ability to participate in politics, so you can't vote. It makes it difficult for individuals to get loans from the banks, so that also limits your economic opportunities. Because of certain complications over their passports, they're not able to travel abroad, right? So the Taiwanese, for the second generation, some of them are not included in their family registers back in Taiwan. So they fall into this legal gray area where they can't get the necessary documents they need from the Taiwanese government in order to go travel abroad. And then there's also a very awkward social phenomenon where intermarriages between Taiwanese men and Okinawan women, their offspring are not recognized as legitimate children, because under the Okinawan law, the family registers are recognized based on the patrilineal line. So if their father was Taiwanese, then that means the child is conferred non-Ryukyuan nationality, which means that they have limited rights. So to avoid that problem, some individuals made the decision to say that the father is unknown, right? So that their child can be defined as Ryukyuan and have more rights. So this is sort of the background, right, that compels the overseas Taiwanese community to start advocating for Japanese naturalization in the 1960s. But this creates a problem because Japan doesn't recognize dual nationality. So in order to become Japanese, you have to relinquish your former nationality. In order to relinquish your former nationality, you need to get a document from the government saying that you renounce your ROC nationality. And the ROC was very loath to provide that documentation to this overseas community. So this is a document that was written in 1963 by government officials who went to go investigate what was happening in Okinawa. And they acknowledged that the overseas Taiwanese community faced a lot of social problems because of the legal system that was in place in Okinawa. And were very sympathetic, but they ultimately concluded that they couldn't give them the documentation that they wanted. And part of the reason was this paranoia about what that could mean for Taiwan's national security at the time. Right? So if we remember back at the map that in the beginning of the slide, right? These islands are very close to Taiwan. These government officials were worried that these overseas Taiwanese would fall prey to, right, Taiwanese independence movement elements, and then they would use that island as a base to harm Taiwan's national security. And so the ROC starts pushing back against the Japanese government, saying that you can't naturalize, you can't naturalize the overseas Taiwanese community who are there. sorry, I just realized I sort of missed some context. So one of the strategies that the overseas Taiwanese used to subvert the requirement to obtain the certificate of renunciation is to claim that they were stateless. So they claimed that because of historical reasons, they were no longer, because they were Japanese nationals under the Japanese Empire and they had never gone to Taiwan after 1945, that they effectively had no state. Right? And this argument works initially until the ROC finds out and lodges a complaint. In 1970, they restart an effort to petition for naturalization again. And this time they start petitioning the American government. And this is a document from sort of the Department of Defense in the US that talks about this problem. And the Department of Defense basically says that we acknowledge that there is this movement, but we can't do anything. We can't change the laws because it would also create a geopolitical problem with Japan if they pressured the Okinawan government to change their laws to allow the Taiwanese to become Ryukyuan, because they feel like if they did, the Japanese government will see it as an attempt to undermine their claims of residual sovereignty over Okinawa. So functionally, the Taiwanese community is stuck, right? They're in a bad situation where they're stuck with this legal status that limits their rights, right? And it's a problem that is getting passed on to the next generation. Now, ironically, ultimately what happens is that in 1971, the ROC is kicked out of the United Nations, right? And so the ROC loses its status internationally. And this also creates a different set of legal challenges for the overseas Taiwanese community in Okinawa and in Japan. And so because the ROC is no longer recognized as a state, the fear is that the Japanese government will automatically recognize the overseas Chinese community as nationals of the PRC instead, right? Because the PRC is now recognized as China in the United Nations. So to avoid that problem, they finally decide to give the overseas communities the documents that they need to naturalize as Japanese, based on the calculation that it would be better to be Japanese than it is to be a Chinese national. So I think this episode is important for local sort of memories because it reshapes how the Okinawans understand the role of the Taiwanese in their society, right? So in the beginning, I mentioned in the 1930s, a lot of Okinawans were unhappy that the Taiwanese were going there to engage in land reclamation because they viewed these actions as a form of dispossession. And so they viewed the Taiwanese as settler colonists. But in the, so this is a sort of a journal that was written at the time that sort of reflects this complaint. It literally says that the Taiwanese people are eating the Yayama Islands, right? So it sort of represents this anxiety that the Yayama Islands are being taken over. But that history basically gets forgotten, or it becomes reconciled because of this naturalization movement, where these overseas Taiwanese are petitioning in local newspapers and in local governments that, no, actually we have contributed a lot to local society. We don't view ourselves as Taiwanese. We view ourselves as Japanese. Like, we learn Japanese, our kids are educated in Japanese school systems, right? And under the Japanese Empire, we served in the military, right? Emphasizing like, that their Japaneseness. And as a strategy, this basically works. So this document over here is a text from the Ishigaki city government, where they petition on behalf of the Taiwanese to the United States saying that, you know, these guys have been living in our society for a long time. They are functionally Japanese. So please figure out a way to help them. And we can also see this reflected, right, in the statements of the overseas Taiwanese who are living there. So Shimada Nagamasa is a second-generation Taiwanese. His father immigrated to Ishigaki in the 1930s, and he's emphasizing here in his statement, in this village yearbook, that you know, I am not Taiwanese. Like, I am Yukyuan. And so this idea of like sort of a kind of reconciliation of like accepting these overseas Taiwanese as being a part of the fabric of the Ishigaki society, or of being a part of an important part of the social and cultural fabric of the island, is something that's accepted now today. And it's reflected in the construction of this monument in 2012 that commemorates the contributions of these overseas Taiwanese to local society. So that's the presentation. I look forward to any comments or questions.
So my last introduction of the day, our newest colleague here at BU in the Department of Religion, Dagina Ndur, who works on trans-Asian Buddhist things across a long historical range, certainly including Taiwan as one of the centers that she thinks about. And so I think we're going to hear about maybe more or less the same time period as the previous paper, but a quite different situation. So Dagina, please.
Thank you, Rob, for the generous introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for staying until the late afternoon. A little bit of context. So my first book project is not really about Taiwan per se. It's more about Mongolia and Tibet, right? Places that are not quite right close to the island of Formosa. But as I sort of follow up on the characters and the Buddhist figures that I study, right, the question of Taiwan eventually emerges very naturally. And I think it's a very important issue for me to examine as a follow-up. So this is going to be part of my second book project, which I'm really kind of examining the post-war lives of Tibeto-Mongolian Buddhists and their diaspora in Taiwan. So this is one kind of case study that I've been tracing, which is a case of Buddhist diplomacy, specifically through relics, right? The passing around of relics. So on November 25, right, 1955, amidst really large crowds, a Japanese Buddhist delegation arrived at Songshan Airport in Taipei, carrying the supposed human remains of the really famous Chinese monk Xuanzang, right, from the medieval period, who walked on foot, right, all the way from China to India, right, to retrieve the sacred text, right, and teachings of Buddhism. Led by Kuramochi Shuho, the abbot of what's called a Sangaku-in temple in Saitama in Japan, just north of Tokyo, they were greeted by people waving Buddhist and Republican Chinese flags. They have arrived in Taiwan to return a part of the human remains of the famous Chinese monk to China after holding on to them for more than a decade since the Japanese Imperial Army first excavated or discovered the buried remains in 1942 when they were constructing a Shinto temple in Nanjing, in the outskirts of Nanjing. So under camera flashes, the Japanese Buddhists moved through a cheering crowd greeted by Chinese Buddhists, through elites, politicians of the ROC, and the seventh Chankya Tuktu, who is sort of the protagonist of the story right here, this Inner Asian or Mongolian Lama, one of the most highly regarded Buddhist reincarnations of Tibeto-Mongolian Buddhism, and head of the Buddhist Association of the ROC at the time. The official repatriation ceremony took place in the Shandao Temple in the center of Taipei the next morning, Kuramochi Shuho, representing Japan, right, pictured over here, handed over the relic box to the 7th Chankyakutuktu, who represented China. Both signed a certificate of relic transfer. The document read, quote, "The sacred bones of Master Xuanzang are reverently welcomed back to the nation, and the handover ceremony is held at Shenda Temple in Taipei City, Taiwan Province." Representative of Japan, Kuramochi Shuho. Representative of China, Chankyakutuktu, November 26, 44th year of the Republic of China. At the ceremony, lectures were also held for the public by prominent Buddhist masters from the Buddhist Association, as well as radio broadcasts about Xuanzang's life. Venerable Yanpei, right, a really kind of active Buddhist master who were active in South Asia, in Singapore, for example, gave lectures on Xuanzang's legacy, while the Mongolian Lama here gave a radio speech in 3 languages, in Mongolian, Tibetan, and Mandarin Chinese, over Xuanzang's contributions to Chinese culture. The Air Force radio of the ROC also aired multiple programs on the repatriation events, including talks on Xuanzang as a spiritual revolutionary, right, lessons on eradicating superstition, and speeches urging Buddhists in mainland China to resist communism and seek freedom. On November 28th, the Japanese Buddhist delegation's visit to Taipei ended with a dinner with the then president of the ROC, Chiang Kai-shek, at his residence, pictured here. This episode of relic diplomacy raises 2 intriguing points, I think. Right, so first, despite Xuanzang's relics being discovered in Nanjing, mainland China, they were nonetheless returned to Taiwan. Second, Xuanzang's remains were handed over to a Mongol reincarnation of Gelug Buddhism, right, rather than to a Chinese Buddhist monk. So contemplating on these 2 points, this paper or presentation explores these questions, right? So why were the relics returned to Taiwan instead of the mainland, right? What was the negotiation process like? What was its implications for post-war Sino-Japanese and Cold War era cross-strait relations, as well as what this episode of Buddhist diplomacy reveals about Taiwan's strata of sovereignty, its interwoven paths, and its multiple futures. So, the Mongol Lama's own writings and a collection of correspondences, which had just been made publicly accessible, right, through the National Library of Taiwan, really tells us that he was the person who actually initiated and oversaw the entire repatriation process. So there's a lot of individual agency in this episode. So in September 1952, the story starts, the Chankyakutuktu, representing, right, the Buddhist Association of the Republic of China, participated in the Second World Fellowship of Buddhists held in Tokyo. There he met Takamori Takasuke, the Japanese army officer who excavated Xuanzang's remains in Nanjing in 1942. After rounds of negotiations, Takamori finally agreed to return only a part of Xuanzang's remains to the ROC in Taiwan. After Takamori's death, the repatriation process actually stalled. After about a year of radio silence, the Mongol Lama contacted Hollington K. Tong, right, Dong Xianguang, the ROC ambassador to Japan at the time, urging him to press the Japanese government to fulfill Takamori's promises. Days later, the ambassador replied with a copy of his letter to Takamori, reiterating the Mongol Lama's wish. The letter emphasized the need for Takamori to honor his commitment of returning Xuanzang's bones back to free China, just emphasized here. During this period, the Chankyakutuktu coordinated with Chiang Kai-shek and Chen Cheng, right, the vice president at the time, regarding the construction and funding of a site for Xuanzang's relics and the reception of the Japanese delegation. In a letter via Chen to Chiang, the Chankyakutuktu alerted the ROC leaders that, according to Takamori, South Asian countries such as India, Thailand, Myanmar, and Vietnam have all expressed their interest in obtaining a part of the relics housed in Japan. Additionally, the Mongol Lama mentioned intelligence from the ambassador Dong about potential CCP interventions from the mainland. Thus, preparing to welcome Xuanzang's relics from Japan became a critical and time-sensitive diplomatic mission. Shortly after, Ambassador Dong informed the Changgyeokdo that the Japanese Buddhist Federation's board of directors had approved the request for repatriation for quote-unquote international goodwill, and would send a delegation to Taiwan in November for what the Japanese delegation called a bone interment ceremony. Throughout September 1955, the Mongol Lama coordinated with Ambassador Dong and local Buddhist leaders in Taiwan to plan the Japanese delegation's visit. A committee was formed for this purpose, with the Mongol Lama's offering to cover all of the delegation's expenses while they stayed in Taiwan, and provided his residence as the headquarters for the repatriation committee, which is located on Qingtian Street in today's Taipei. Many Buddhist communities across Taiwan competed actually to serve as the permanent home of the relic, right, because of its auspiciousness. In the end, it was decided by the Changgyeokdo himself that the Xuanzang Pagoda would be built in Nantou at the southern shore of the Sun Moon Lake. The Japanese delegation arrived as planned on November 25th, 1955, and toured around the island after the repatriation ceremony ended, leaving for Japan in December. Despite the Mongol Lama's organizational efforts, challenges arose. Upon learning of the repatriation of Xuanzang remains to Taiwan, Zhao Puchu, serving as the Secretary General of the Chinese Buddhist Association, which is the both Buddhist association on the mainland in the PRC, issued an open letter urging the cessation of the relics transfer to Taiwan. However, ROC representatives in Japan successively negotiated with the Japanese Buddhist Federation to ensure that the relics repatriation to Taiwan ended up in Taiwan despite PRC intervention. Ambassador Dong clarified that while Zhao Puchu and the PRC insisted on the relics return to the mainland due to what they called alleged Japanese theft, it was primarily a matter of actually Sino-Japanese Buddhist diplomacy, cautioning against its escalation into a broader political issue that would bring quote-unquote unpleasant influences onto the free world. There were also objections from some Japanese Buddhists regarding the exchange between Japan and Free China in Taiwan. Many of them actually questioned, right, where China is and should be. Right? So Zhao Puchu's letter of protest was originally addressed to Otani Kocho, right, the chief abbot of the Jodo Shinshu Otani sect, and the previous chairman of the Japanese Buddhist Federation, and to Otani Adrian, actually this head of this really PRC-leaning Japan-China Buddhist exchange group. So this group reportedly joined the Chinese Buddhist associations on the mainland to block the transfer of the relics to Taiwan. Nonetheless, just weeks before their scheduled visit to Taiwan, the board of directors of the Japanese Buddhist Federation finally held an emergency meeting and decided once and for all that the final destination of Xuanzang relics remains in Taiwan. 3 justifications were provided for this decision. One, right, the relic was not forcibly taken by Japan in 1942, but was freely given to Japan by Chu Mingyi, right, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Wang Jingwei regime in Nanjing, right, which is pictured here. This is the exact right moment where, right, Wang Jingwei and Chu Mingyi, right, and a representative from Japan, Mamoru Shigemitsu, right, agreed that they would, exchange the relics, parts of the relics, as a form of friendship between the Japanese Empire and the Wang Jingwei regime. And the second point that they suggested to support, right, the idea that we need to send the relic to Taiwan and not the PRC is that the transfer of the relic to Taiwan was deemed a religious matter, right, and not affecting the friendly relationships between the Japanese and Chinese Buddhists on both sides of the strait, right? So they want to make sure, emphasize that this is purely, right, exchange between the Buddhists, right, in the religious realm, and not escalated onto sort of a geopolitical sphere. And third, Xuanzang's relics were already present on the mainland, right? They already have some relics, right? Whereas none were in Taiwan. So I argue that the return of Xuanzang's remains to the ROC in Taiwan and not to the PRC, right, on the mainland, was not only treated as a significant development in Sino-Japanese relations after the end of World War II, but as a really meaningful kind of event for the ROC in their struggles to present themselves as an authentic and free China on the international stage during the Cold War. Right? This is the 1950s and early 60s. Within this geopolitical context, the Jangyak Tutu, or the Mongolian Lama here, who wielded considerable symbolic and political capital and power, right, as a representative of the ROC's distant frontiers in Tibet and Mongolia, as well as exiled Buddhist community, played a really pivotal role in facilitating the return of Shenzhen's remains to proper China, authentic China. Leveraging his political and religious networks and resources, right, the Jangyak Tutu here persuaded the Japanese Federation to repatriate this culturally significant artifact to the ROC, which, unlike the communist PRC, was regarded as a true guardian of Chinese Buddhism, culture, and religious freedom. Right, importantly, more. In his address to the at the 1950s repatriation ceremony in Taipei, right, this is actually the photo taken right when he was given the exact address. Right, the Jangyak Tutu actually commended the Japanese Buddhists for their politically astute and morally upright decisions. So I'm going to read a little bit of his speech given here, translated to English. He says, quote, "The Japanese Buddhists, undeterred by Zhu and Mao's fabrications, right, Zhu and Mao Zedong, have made the firm decision to return the sacred bones of Master Xuanzang to free China. For the past 6 years, they, the CCP, have been implementing Leninist policies of religion is the opiate of the masses on the mainland. Do they think they can cover the ears and eyes of the people in the free world with their hypocritical facade? If religious freedom still exists on the mainland under the control of the Zhu and Mao bandits, why didn't the Japanese Buddhists send Master Xuanzang's relics there for the 450 million brothers and sisters to worship? Why would the Japanese Buddhists send back Master Xuanzang's relics to free China and let only 8 million people to worship? Isn't this solid evidence showing who really has bona fide religious freedom?" End quote. On the other hand, the handover episode, right, I argue, was also used by the modernist and elite Chinese Buddhists from the mainland in Taiwan, right, who were the Waishengren in this story, to establish discourses on what is called authentic Buddhism, which for them is represented by the mainland Buddhist pedigree and the arrival of Xuanzang's remains, who himself traveled to India for so-called authentic Buddhist teachings and disciplines. Right? So this authentic Buddhism that has roots on the mainland was then contrasted to both the superstitious Buddhist practices of the local Taiwanese communities and the colonial legacy left by missionary Japanese Buddhism on the island. So in an issue of Haichaoyin, right, a prominent Buddhist periodical, pictured here, the editorial team writes on the return of the relic, saying, commenting, "Because Taiwan is the headquarters of our nation's restoration, the Japanese reopened the pagoda, divided the bones, and returned them to our new nation." Further, they said, "Due to decades of oppression from the colonial policies of Japanese imperialism, many brothers and sisters in the Taiwan province are trapped by religious practices concerning ancestors, superstitions in ghosts and spirits, and secularized Buddhism." What they're referring to is the kind of Buddhism that allows the monks, right, to get married and have children, which is, characteristic of Japanese Buddhism, right? So they comment on how this kind of Buddhism is wrong, right? So they continue to say this kind of Buddhism was the most prominent or dominant amongst the Buddhist traditions that also incorporated military and political influences. Under these circumstances, our brothers and sisters in the Taiwan province live amongst the disorder and chaos between superstition and the Buddhist faith, while the Buddhist temples and monastics that represent Buddhism were also influenced by Japanese secularized Buddhism. Therefore, they have lost all their authenticity as real Buddhist traditions. They continue to comment, right? Quote, "We hope that through the placing and worshipping of the Tripitaka Master's skull a new page can be written in the history of Buddhism in the Taiwan province, eliminating the bad habits of Japanese Buddhism and establishing a Buddhist demeanor that is pure, dignified, and solemn. And in his congratulatory message for the repatriation ceremony, Otani Kojo, who was the chairman of the Japanese Buddhist Association, a federation at the time, further remarked on the importance of the Buddhist alliance in a Cold War climate, right, that separates East Asian countries from one another, which itself is a sign for him, right, a sign of Mako, which is the degeneration of the Buddhist teachings. He says in this letter, the end times have indeed revealed serious aspects in various facets of human society. However, the peace of humanity can only be achieved through the widespread belief in the Buddhist teachings of selflessness and oneness. Now, with the division of Master Xuanzang's bones as a karmic opportunity, I pray sincerely for the revival of Mahayana Buddhism in Taiwan, and of course, on mainland China, but also in Japan, and even in North and South Korea, so that the dark clouds of East Asia can be transformed into a harmonious peace and handshake, unquote. So it's clear that for the Japanese Buddhists, right, the repatriation of Xuanzang's human remains reveals efforts to reestablish Sino-Japanese relations in the post-World War II world order, but also to do so very, very carefully, while negotiating the two China problem and even the two Korea problems in an escalating Cold War environment. Right, so to quickly kind of conclude, I think this episode of Buddhist relic diplomacy really highlights, right, Taiwan's complex, what I call strata of sovereignty, right, a place where religious, political, and transnational forces really intersect, right, in layered and sometimes contradictory ways. And the return of Xuanzang's remains to Taiwan rather than to the mainland was not a mere religious event. It reveals how interwoven layers of Taiwan's past, right, colonial, nationalist, and transnational, all come together to help the ROC, right, to assert itself as the rightful guardian of Chinese religion and culture, an image reinforced by its Cold War era ideological positioning as free and authentic China during the longest martial law period in the history of humankind. At the same time, right, the decision to entrust these remains, right, to the Changyang, to this Mongolian Lama, this inner Asian reincarnate Lama, rather than to a Chinese Buddhist leader, I think speaks to another layer of Taiwan's history that is often overlooked. One that extends beyond the conventional narratives and geography of a Chinese nation-state. Right? The Changyang Kudukdo's role as both a representative of the ROC and a figure rooted in Tibetan Mongolian Buddhist traditions reminds us that Taiwan's religious and political networks were not solely Han Chinese, but deeply entangled with those of Inner Asia, right? In places like Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang even. Regions key to the geopolitical ambitions of the multicultural Qing Empire, and at this moment, the phantom limbs of the ROC after its return or retreat to Taiwan. Ultimately, I think this case study illustrates how Taiwan's past cannot really be understood in singular linear history, but rather as multiple overlapping histories, right? The theme of our conference today, I think many of our previous papers have really illustrated that really well, right? But as multiple overlapping histories, right? Be it colonial, nationalist, transnational, and diasporic. Right? Likewise, its future remains, I think, similarly layered, right? Shaped by ongoing negotiations of identity, sovereignty, multilateral geopolitical relations, and tensions. Right? So I think through this lens, Taiwan emerges not just as a contested geopolitical space, but also as a really dynamic site where competing visions of history and religious belonging, right, in my case, continues to unfold. Right? So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you.